We are very pleased that Arthur Wheelock will now take the Frick stage to frame the issues for us with his keynote address. And I will introduce Arthur briefly. Arthur K. Wheelock Jr. is curator of Northern Baroque painting at the National Gallery of Art and professor of art history at the University of Maryland. He has lectured widely on Dutch and Flemish art, and he has written many articles and a number of books and catalogs, among these Vermeer and the Art of Painting, and the catalogs of the Dutch and Flemish collections at the National Gallery of Art. Arthur has also organized a number of major exhibitions at the National Gallery, including Anthony van Dyck in 1990, Johannes Vermeer in 1995, Jan Steen, painter and storyteller, in 1996, Pride of Place, 2009, and Pleasure and Piety, the art of Joachim Utewaal, in 2015. In 1982, Arthur was named Knight Officer, I think that's Ridder, right, in the Order of Orange-Nassau by the Dutch government. In 1993, he received the College Art Association National Institute for Conservation Award for distinction in scholarship and conservation. In 1996, he received the Minda de Ginsburg Prize for the Best Exhibition Catalog of 1995. That was Johannes Vermeer. He also received the Johannes Vermeer Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Dutch Art, the Bicentennial Medal from Williams College, and the Dutch American Achievement Award presented by the Netherlands American Amity Trust. Arthur has a lot of honors, actually. In 2006, he was named Commander in the Order of Leopold I by the Belgian government. And in 2008, the University of Maryland created a doctoral fellowship in his name. His online catalog of the Dutch collection at the National Gallery of Art received the George Wittenborn Memorial Book Award in 2014 for being the best art publication in the United States. And last year, Arthur received the Kellogg Award from Williams College in honor of his distinguished career. In addition to all of this, a little bird told me it's Arthur's birthday today. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Esmée, and thank you so much for having me. Of course, one of the other little bird things is Esmée used to work with me at the National Gallery, so, and one of the wonderful interns that I've worked with, assistants over the years, and very, very thrilled to be here today to be part of this wonderful celebration on Flemish art. And it's a fascinating subject that comfortably fits in the framework of the series that Esmée mentioned of studies here, organized here at the Frick by the Center for the History of Collecting. My hope is that I can provide a framework for the more focused talks on collectors and collecting patterns in America that we will enjoy in this symposium. The story that we will explore here today begins in the early years of the 19th century and continues to this very day, a time frame that differs little from the Center's earlier symposium on collecting Dutch art. However, the narrative for collecting Flemish paintings is remarkably different. Instead of forming collections that included a wide range of artists and types of paintings, as was done with the Dutch, Americans traditionally focused their energies on two masters, Peter Paul Rubens and Anthony van Dyck. Only sporadically did they collect works by other Flemish artists, primarily genre scenes by David Teniers and still life paintings by Frans Snyders. And so these are some in our American collections that you see here, and Jan Veit on the left us in Boston. The irony, of course, is that Americans, private collectors and museums alike, were not drawn to Rubens and Van Dyck because they were Flemish, but because they were important internationally, largely due to their successful careers in England and Italy, and the huge impact that they had throughout later centuries. One should first ask what the term Flemish art has meant to most Americans. This is a complicated question, for while many Flemish artists, such as Teniers, were devoted to the same ideals of realism that characterized much of Dutch art, many artists, most famously Rubens and Van Dyck, also produced explicitly Catholic images for large altarpieces, as in Rubens' painting that's in Toledo, or private worship, as the Van Dyck painting at the National Gallery. Flemish art also had strong bent toward allegory and mythology, and was often executed in abstract visual language. Reconciling these two realms, the realistic and the abstract, has always been a challenge in the study of this era. Another fundamental question that Americans would have had to face, of course, is what and where is Flanders? It is not a country, but a province. And this is a map that shows Flanders here in the southern, just there's the Netherlands and Dutch world and the Flemish world down here, but here's Flanders. But a province, not only a province, but in a region that throughout much of its history has been almost impossible to define politically. Even if a 19th century American knew that Flanders was part of the southern Netherlands and had once belonged to the Spanish Empire, its later history is totally confusing. In the 18th century, this area became part of Austria, then part of France. After Napoleon's defeat in 1814, the southern Netherlands, including Flanders, was ruled by the Dutch king, William I. This situation, however, only lasted until 1830, when the southern Netherlands revolted, its Declaration of Independence ratified in 1839 at the Treaty of London. This new country was called Belgium, with King Leopold I its first ruler. And here's a map, 19th century map, showing that division of the Netherlands and Belgium down below, just so we know today what we're talking about. For most Americans, however, such political distinctions were of little consequence, and the two countries were often referred to as the Netherlands or the Low Countries. The importance of Flanders' artistic legacy, however, has never been questioned. We need to turn to no other source than Baedeker's Belgium and Holland, a standard handbook for 19th century American travelers, where it is stated that, quote, the works of the painter and architect are Belgium's great attractions. The 15th and 16th century Netherlandish artists discussed in this traveler's guide are a veritable who's who of the period's great masters, ranging from Jan van Eyck to Peter Bruegel. But Baedeker asserts that their achievements, quote, sink into insignificance besides the extraordinary capacity displayed by the Flemish artists of the 17th century. Rubens dominates Baedeker's text because, quote, his great historical importance, which stems from his capacity to fuse Italian traditions with those from the north. Rubens was also celebrated for his fertile imagination, for the wide range of his artistic creations, from biblical mythological subjects to portraits, landscapes, and genre scenes. Nevertheless, it soon becomes very clear that despite such accolades, the German art professor who wrote Baedeker's text did not really love Rubens's work. He attributed some weaknesses to workshop participation and some to Rubens' predilection to render form, quote, repugnant to our modern notions. He was particularly disturbed by Rubens' manner of portraying the female, where the master, quote, could, he writes, be charged with a flagrant want of taste. And I think he might have something like this in mind, this painting in Munich of the drunken Silenus. He laments, among other felicitous elements in Rubens's work, the spectacle of naked females disfigured by the labors of maternity. Baedeker's is hardly a standard by which one should judge historical reputations of artists, but this text effectively makes the point that Rubens's art was not universally beloved. In Belgium, however, Rubens's star never shone brighter. In 1840, the leaders of this newly independent country, in search of a cultural hero who could epitomize its historical legacy and international significance, quickly identified Rubens as that individual. The timing coincided with the bicentennial in 1840 of Rubens' death, and to commemorate that occasion, a sculpture of the great artist was commissioned to be displayed in front of the Antwerp Cathedral. In America, however, the situation was quite different. Rubens was not an easy artist for Americans to love. He was too Catholic, too connected to the grand courts of Europe, too facile, too dependent on his workshop to execute his designs, and of course, the women in his paintings were far too fat. He may have been one of the great masters of all time, but these objections were tough obstacles to overcome for a largely Protestant nation that had revolted against the monarchy with its courtly culture and that valued tangible reality over abstract allegorical concepts. George Henry Calvert, the first American to write a book about Rubens, which he published in Boston in 1876, did his best to alleviate criticisms of Rubens' manner of painting and to defend the artist against the criticism that his women were overweight, writing, "A stereotyped but much exaggerated reproach against Rubens is that in historical and sacred subjects, he takes for models of female figures his heavy, muscular countrywoman." And he might have had a painting like this in mind, which was actually in his home, so he knew this painting well. As if the female sex attained in Flanders to stouter, coarser stature than in Germany or England. Not only is this not the case, but to judge by the 19th century, the female figure does not in Flanders tend to so much an overabundant plumpness as in England. Calvert had many reasons for his love of Rubens. Born in Baltimore in 1803, he had twice traveled to Europe where he had seen many of the artist's paintings. Most importantly, Calvert was a direct descendant of Rubens, had lived amidst a number of Rubens' masterpieces during his childhood in Riversdale, Maryland, and owned one of the rare Rubens paintings then in America. The remarkable collection at Riversdale was that of Henri Joseph Stier d'Artzelaar, a sixth-generation descendant of Peter Paul Rubens. His wife, Marie-Louise Peters, was also a descendant of Rubens' family. Stier d'Artzelaar brought his family and the art collection to this country from Antwerp in 1794 because he feared the widening impact of the French Revolution. After landing in Philadelphia, Henri and Marie-Louise soon located to Bladensburg, Maryland, near the new federal city, Washington, where they built Riversdale. And this is Riversdale as you see it today, and this is an old print of it. Although the couple was well connected socially, political and financial circumstances soon called them back to Antwerp. In 1803, they left the property and the care of the paintings to their daughter Rosalie and her husband George Calvert. Their son, George Henry Calvert, the author of the Rubens monograph, was born in the year of the grandparents' departure. Many of the 63 paintings in this collection remain crated for the 22 years that they were in America. Some, however, hung in the family's homes where they were seen by Rembrandt Peale when he painted Henri's portrait in 1799 on the left, and by Gilbert Stuart when he painted Rosalie and George Henry Calvert in 1804. Before the collection was returned to Antwerp in April 1816, and that is really 200 years ago, there actually is a celebration at Riversdale at this very moment about this occasion, Rosalie and George, at the urging of Rembrandt Peale, unpacked the entire lot and opened Riversdale so that art lovers could experience it firsthand. Peale wrote of the occasion, "It was a new and pleasant sight to witness such an animated assemblage of artists and amateurs, members of Congress from the different states, merchants, lawyers, and country gentlemen, all engaged in discussing the merits of pictures and painters." So, what great treasures graced the walls of this mansion in 1816? The packing list, which is here, and I thank Susan Pearl who is in the Maryland Circle Society, for sharing all this with me, and we're working together on this for some wonderful years together. Anyhow, this packing list, Peel's account, and descriptions of the works and subsequent sales held in Antwerp in 1817, 22, and 48 give an excellent overview of the collection. At its core were masterpieces by Flemish artists, although it also included paintings by, among others, Jacob van Ruysdael, Rembrandt, Titian, and Tintoretto. The collection contained no fewer than 10 paintings by Rubens, 6 by Van Dyck, including these Philippe Leroy and Marie de Rat, who are now in the Wallace collection, as well as paintings by an array of other Flemish artists, among them Adrian Brouwer, David Vinkbones, Joost de Momper, Peter Naves, Daniel Segers, Jan Burgel the Elder, this wonderful painting that proudly now hangs at the Getty of Noah's Ark. In fact, in both quality and quantity, no collection of Flemish art in this country would rival it until late in the 20th century. Rubens' paintings dominated the collection. They include the Masters Caritas Romana, now in the Rijksmuseum, the Prodigal Son in Antwerp, the portrait of Petrus Picres in Brussels, and Rubens' portrait of his brother Philip, now in the Detroit Institute of Arts. George Calvert himself purchased back Romulus and Remus at the 1822 sale and brought it back to Riversdale. This work, which has remained in the family, is currently on view at the North Carolina Museum of Art and has the distinction of being the Rubens painting with the longest American provenance. Interestingly, the possibility of the United States acquiring the collection to form a national museum was suggested by Rosalie's older brother, Charles Steer. In a letter written from Antwerp to George Calvert shortly before the sale of 1822, Charles urged that the sale be advertised in America, where, quote, besides private amateurs, it might fall in the plans of the government to begin the formation of a national museum with pictures so genuine and so well known. Unfortunately, it did not happen, and the United States would have to wait almost 130 years for a National Gallery of Art to open, not far away in Washington, D.C. While important for our story, the Steer-Calvert collection in Riversdale was essentially here for safekeeping and not the result of American collectors. So aside from this remarkable array of masterpieces, where might other Flemish paintings be found in America in the 19th century? The answer seems to be that they were few and far between, and always as part of broader collections of European art. A few Flemish paintings could have been seen in the 1820s in Bordentown, New Jersey, in the collection of the exiled Joseph Bonaparte. In the 1840s, one had traveled to Baltimore to visit the collection of Robert Gilmore, Jr., one of the lucky art lovers who had seen the Steer collection. And in 1852, one could have seen a larger group of Flemish paintings in New York in Thomas Jefferson Bryan's Gallery of Christian Art, a collection he amassed when he lived in France during the 1830s and 1840s. Like Charles Steer before him, Bryant, here in the picture, a portrait by Sully, hoped that his paintings could inspire the formation of a national gallery to benefit the public at large. The quality of his works, however, was not always that high, so it is probably just as well that it did not happen. Among the hundreds of works Bryant owned were 7 paintings attributed to Rubens, including St. Catherine, the largest number of any artist in his collection, along with paintings attributed to Teniers, Van Dyck, and Snyders. When Bryant closed his gallery in 1867 and donated his collection to the New York Historical Society, these were the first paintings by and or attributed to these Flemish artists to enter a public collection in this country. Although Bryant admired Rubens for his Christian characteristics, the author of Bryant's catalog, Richard Grant White, was less sanguine about the artist and commented on, quote, the artist's predilection for excessively plump women. The charge of grossness is made with much reason against his female figures. The difficulties Americans had with Rubens, however, were greater than a few extra pounds around the arms, thighs, and midriff. The art critic Kenyon Cox probably expressed it best when he wrote in 1905 that Rubens was, quote, often coarse and vulgar. Cox found little to love in the, quote, allegory, the pomposity, the exaggeration, and the bad taste of his pictures. Rubens's oil sketches and portraits, however, were a different matter. And in these realms, artists did find sympathetic works with which they could live. John G. Johnson of Philadelphia, for example, owned a number of Rubens's oil sketches, including a study of the Constantine's tapestry series. Although it is not certain when Johnson acquired this sketch, he bought it as well as another Rubens oil sketch from Gallery Sedlmayr in Paris in the mid-1890s, probably at the recommendation of Willem van Bode, who came to Philadelphia as part of a trip visiting collectors on the East Coast after attending the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Johnson, who was a successful corporate lawyer for, among others, P.A.B. Widener, only became an avid collector of 16th and 17th century Flemish paintings at about that time. It may well be that Widener and Johnson both acquired their paintings from Sedlmayr in 1894, the year in which Widener made his first purchase of a Flemish painting, Anthony van Dyck's portrait of the prefect Raphael Ragy. Johnson continued to acquire Rubens's oil sketches for the rest of his life, often with the advice of Willem Valentiner, who wrote a catalog of Johnson's collection in 1913. Johnson bequeathed his collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1917, works that form the core of that museum's remarkable group of Flemish paintings. In 1895, however, Johnson had already assumed an important role in the fledgling Philadelphia Museum when he was appointed a trustee of the Wilstach Fund and helped guide acquisition priorities to fill the museum's rather empty walls. These funds allowed the museum to acquire two enormous Flemish paintings, Franz Snyder's vast still life with terms and the bust of Ceres in 1899, and 3 years later, Cornelis de Vos' even larger portrait of Anthony Reiners and his family. The need to fill empty galleries was not only felt in Philadelphia, but also in other newly created museums in New York, Boston, and Detroit. And in this respect, Rubens's big and bold religious and mythological paintings worked perfectly. One important museum benefactor who acquired a painting by Rubens for this purpose at the end of the 19th century was James E. Scripps from Detroit, whose fortune came from his newspaper enterprise. Scripps traveled to Europe in 1887, where he purchased a large number of old master paintings that he donated to the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1889, 1 year after its founding. Among them was Rubens's large Meeting of David and Abigail from around 1630, formerly in the Duc de Richelieu collection. Scripps hoped that his gift would form the nucleus of an important collection in Detroit. His aspirations were not small. He wondered, why might not Detroit aspire to the honor and become the Florence or Munich of this continent? Scripps was one of a number of wealthy Americans who sought to establish themselves as socially conscious individuals individuals by associating themselves with local cultural institutions. Even though Scripps had little personal interest in collecting paintings by Rubens, he recognized that the artist was a major figure in the history of European art and that his paintings elevated the significance of a museum's collection. Between 1897, when the Protectionist Dingley Act was instituted, and 1909, when it was rescinded, U.S. tax laws explicitly encouraged such philanthropy. The Dingley Act imposed extremely high tariffs of about 20% of value when imported art was brought for the home. When the art was bought for a museum, however, it was not taxed. The finest Rubens painting to come to this country at the end of the 19th century was the master's extraordinary portrait of Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, which Isabella Stewart Gardner, at the urging of Bernard Berenson, acquired in 1898. Berenson viewed the acquisition of this Titianesque portrait as a coup, comparable in significance to Mrs. Gardner's purchase of Titian's Europa. As with many Americans from this era, Mrs. Gardner envisioned sharing such treasures with the public by forming her own museum, which she did only 2 years later. She later reflected upon her motivation. Years ago, I decided that the greatest need in our country was art. We were largely developing the other sides. We're a very young country and had very few opportunities of seeing beautiful things like art. So I determined to make it my life work if I could. Nevertheless, it should be noticed that after she acquired the Rubens, she had it sent to Paris rather than Boston and only imported it at the time she formed her museum so that it would not be subject to the high tariffs of the Dingley Act. Unfortunately, many of the first Rubens paintings in this country turned out to be copies or workshop pieces. In 1895, when Willem van Bode wrote an article complimenting Americans upon the improved level of quality of works in the collections, he noted that none of the Rubens paintings he had seen in the New York Historical Society or the Metropolitan Museum of Art were actually by the master. The Rubens situation at the Met, however, improved significantly at the beginning of the 20th century. And here is the Met, with the acquisition of Holy Family with Saints Francis Anne and the infant John the Baptist. The gift illustrates the complex motivations that sometimes accompanied early 20th century philanthropic gestures. Unlike Scripps, who seems to have had an earnest desire to help establish a cultural climate in Detroit, the Met's acquisition resulted more from desire for social advancement than altruism. The full scope of this tale is too complex to delve into detail here, but it concerns James Henry Smith, who received a huge inheritance in 1899. Smith quickly decided that he would spend lavishly to establish himself in the upper echelons of New York society, and figured that a donation to the Met would aid him in this quest. His gift of choice was Rubens's painting, a choice largely motivated by the notoriety of the work, stemming from the fact that the government had seized it in 1900 because it had been imported with an artificially low value. Smith, with a lot of maneuvering, acquired the painting at auction in 1902, sent it to the Met, and reveled in the accolades and positive press he then received. And this is him going down Fifth Avenue, presumably the day after he gave it. I don't know exactly. Although the representation of Rubens in America had improved significantly after Bode's visit in 1893, the number of works and their overall quality remained quite low for some time. Willem Valentiner, seen here, commented upon the poor quality of the European paintings at the Met while he served as its curator of decorative arts in the first decades of the 20th century. Valentiner, however, actively worked to raise that level, particularly of Rubens' paintings, by advising private collectors such as Johnson and by advocating museum purchases. For example, in 1910, he encouraged the Met's curator of paintings, Bryson Burroughs, to acquire the large A Wolf and Fox Hunt, the painting's first purchase of a Rubens painting. Large in scale, dramatic in activity, and with a long and distinguished provenance and English to boot, it transformed the quality of the museum's small Rubens collection. Although Valentino was still lamenting about the paltry representations of Rubens in this country in 1914, in 1946, he substantially revised this assessment, for he was then able to list 142 works by Rubens in private and public collections, 3 times as many as previously. He was only critical of one institution, the recently formed National Gallery of Art in Washington, which only had one Rubens painting. Valentina had much to do with this increased interest in Rubens and Flemish art in America. After serving in the German army in World War I, he became the director of the Detroit Institute of Arts, where he enriched that museum's Flemish collection with important acquisitions, including Rubens's portrait of his brother Philip, which had once been part of the Riversdale collection. He also made an effort to expand the range of Flemish art, acquiring, among others, paintings by Jan Veit, Joost de Momper, and Michael Sverts. And I realize Michael Sverts is not Flemish, but as far as, since I'm just an American, I'll let it slip by. He also organized a Van Dyck exhibition in 1929 and encouraged private collectors to gift their paintings to the museum. In this way, Detroit acquired another Rubens oil sketch and a major painting by Jacob Jordans. Later, he helped bring an important group of Flemish paintings to Raleigh when he became director of that museum. Before progressing with our overview, we must turn our attention back to the Flemish master who inspired wealthy American collectors around the turn of the 20th century, Anthony van Dyck. Although three magnificent paintings by Van Dyck were at Riversdale, they returned to Antwerp in 1816. Two of these masterpieces that we've seen earlier, Philippe Leroy and Marie de Rat, were eventually sold to the fourth Marquis of Hartford, who outbid an agent of the Russian Tsar in the drama-filled auction. These pendants joined other great Van Dyck paintings that English aristocrats had enthusiastically collected for over a century, including ones from the master's Genoese period. The artist's reputation reached its apogee in 1899, the 300th anniversary of his birth, which was celebrated with enormous exhibitions in both Antwerp and London. Wealthy Americans looked to English aristocrats as models for their lifestyle, not only in the character of their homes, but also in the types of art to collect. The elegant and refined bearing of Van Dyck's portraits, and even his religious and mythological paintings, struck a chord with American bankers and industrialists, among them Benjamin Altman, P.A.B. Widener, Andrew Mellon, and Henry Clay Frick, as in this wonderful painting of James Stanley, 7th Earl of Derby, here in the Frick collection. Their passion and insatiable desire to possess works by Van Dyck was quickly noted by English art dealers, among them Colnaghi, Knoedler, and Devine, who were all too willing to encourage the collecting rivalries that existed among these Americans. These dealers, knowing that their clients particularly admired paintings that had a British provenance, used their contacts to disengage masterpieces from English aristocrats. In this, they were assisted by changing tax laws. In England, both the Estate Duties Law of 1894 and the Finance Act of 1909 forced English collectors to sell family heirlooms to pay excessive taxes. At the same time, in the United States, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Bill abolished import duties on works of art older than 100 years. The timing of the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Bill could not have come at a better moment for Widener, who had just acquired three magnificent portraits from Van Dyck's Genoese period, Elena Grimaldi and her two children. A dramatic coup that added luster to the reputation of Widener as a collector. These paintings came not from England, but from Italy, smuggled out of that country by being rolled up in a fake exhaust pipe. The paintings were immediately celebrated and exhibited in the Van Dyck exhibition organized in 1909 by Knoedler, who was instrumental in getting these paintings out of Italy, the first monographic exhibition of an old master held in America. The current Van Dyck exhibition at the Frick is filled with the types of paintings that appealed to Henry Clay Frick and his contemporaries. Although a few Van Dyck paintings did enter museums at an early stage, such as Henry Marcon's 1889 donation to the Met of two Van Dyck portraits, including James Stewart, most of Van Dyck's masterpieces were destined for collectors' homes. In this respect, the differences in attitudes towards Van Dyck and Rubens is stunning. Van Dyck elevated collectors' lives and their cultural status, and they wanted to be around his paintings, which was not the case with Rubens, except in such a rare instance as Isabel Student Gardner's portrait of Arundel. It is fascinating that among the combined donations of Widener and Mellon paintings to the newly formed National Gallery of Art, there were 12 major paintings by Van Dyck and only 2 attributed to Rubens, one of which was an 18th century French painting, and the other, in fact, by Van Dyck. His engaging depiction of Isabella Brandt, Rubens' wife, one of the many masterpieces Mellon acquired from the Hermitage. The extent to which Rubens' paintings started entering American collections after the 1920s, as documented by Valentino in 1946, represents a remarkable shift in attitude towards this master's work. Although many of these paintings were oil sketches and portraits that fit within the parameters of what Americans had traditionally deemed acceptable, there were exceptions. None more so than the 4 huge paintings then thought to be cartoons for the Triumph of the Eucharist Tapestry series, which John Ringling acquired in the 1920s. Ringling's decision to collect Rubens' paintings for his planned museum in Sarasota was intimately connected with his aspirations to develop it into a destination that would attract visitors from around the world. Ringling wanted to collect paintings that had a different flavor than those of other wealthy American collectors. He reasoned that as if his museum were to compete with institutions in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, it would need a different ambiance and visual experience. Hence, European collections more than American ones served as his inspiration. In 1926, Ringling, on his annual trip to Europe to find new acts for his circus, traveled to London with his art dealer, Julius Bühler, and that's Ringling on the left and Bühler on the right, where they visited the Duke of Westminster, who was selling his, quote, famous Rubens cartoons for the Eucharist series. Ringling was hardly fazed by the painting's scale and high price, and in fact, the very size and expressive character made them all the more desirable for his new enterprise. What Ringling recognized, according to Bühler, was that the 4 paintings would make his museum look like one of the old museums in Europe, and that no American museum had anything similar. Ringling, of course, was absolutely right. In one fell swoop, he could bring to Sarasota an overwhelming visual experience equivalent to standing before Rubens' Maria de' Medici series in the Louvre. Ringling was drawn to Rubens because he wanted big, impressive paintings, but also because he was an admirer of Italian Baroque painting, with its flights of fancy and emotional drama at a time when this style was entirely out of fashion and relatively inexpensive. Rubens' grand paintings were as close to Italian Baroque as one could come, not only in their allegorical and often Catholic subject matter, but also in their bold colors and expressive qualities. Indeed, a remarkable parallel exists between American attitudes, 19th century attitudes toward Italian Baroque painting and Rubens. In 1860, the influential Charles Eliot Norton, professor at Harvard, dismissed Italian Baroque painting for its, quote, coarse materialism, disgusting exaggeration, and the utter want of elevation or truth of expression. An assessment rather remarkably similar to Kenyon Cox's disdain for, quote, the allegory, the pomposity, the exaggeration, and the bad taste of Rubens' pictures. The broader acceptance of Rubens' paintings in the 1940s paralleled the reassessment of Italian Baroque painting then occurring in this country. Much credit goes to Chick Austin, the forward-thinking director of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, who actively sought to acquire Baroque paintings, among them Rubens' Return of the Holy Family from Egypt in 1938, and 5 years later, the first authentic Caravaggio painting to enter an American collection. Also helping change collecting dynamics was Samuel H. Kress, who by the late 1940s had assembled an outstanding collection of Baroque art, including paintings by Rubens. It is in this broader context that we should view two major museum acquisitions of Rubens' paintings in 1950, the powerful Prometheus Bound in Philadelphia and the magnificent Crowning of St. Catherine in Toledo. Types of paintings that would have been anathema to earlier generations of Americans. Now they were deemed great coups and were celebrated for their boldly expressive character. Indeed, ever since the 1950s, private collectors and museums across the country have embraced Rubens' art, and the many acquisitions of his work have meant that this country now offers an incredibly broad and diverse view of Rubens' paintings. For example, over the last half-century, remarkable changes have occurred in the presentation of Rubens in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. The Met has added 7 more Rubens paintings to its collection, including the artist's earliest known portrait. The National Gallery of Art, which progressed from its slow start, has acquired 11 paintings by and attributed to Rubens, including the magnificent Spinola Doria, a gift of the Crest collection. And the J. Paul Getty Museum has added an equal number, including Mars Disarmed by Venus, a collaboration by Rubens and Bruegel that the museum acquired in 2000 in honor of John Walsh. The story about collecting Flemish art in America, however, is no longer just about Rubens and Van Dyck. Other artists are rightfully taking their place in the canon. Outstanding paintings by Osias Beert, Jan Bruegel, Jacob Jordans, Joost de Mumper, Frans Snijders, Michael Sweerts, David Teniers can be found in private and public collections across the country. For example, a visit to Raleigh will reward your Bruegel's wonderful harbor scene with St. Paul and Jacob Jordans' The Virgin Child with John the Baptist and his parents. Both acquisitions that owe much to the initiative of the museum's then director, Willem Valentiner. Paintings by these masters, however, can also be enjoyed elsewhere, as in Louisville, St. Louis, and Springfield, Massachusetts. Sweerts is amazingly well represented in this country, not only in Hartford, which houses one of his most endearing paintings, but also in Oberlin with his compelling self-portrait. And recently arrived at the National Gallery, Sweerts' fascinating portrait of Anthony Bourdes having his boot pulled off by his page. Aside from such works by such well-known artists, exceptional masterpieces by lesser-known artists have also been acquired, including the Los Angeles County Museum's The Snijders Triptych, a painting by Jan Boekhorst for the tomb of Franz Snyder's wife's sister, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston's Adoration of the Magi of the Shepherds by Theodor von Loon, yet another master from Brussels, but once again, we're part of the big family here, including him in this story. Part of the excitement about Flemish art in America has come about from the impetus of major exhibitions in recent years. Among these, we can count the Van Dyck exhibition in Washington in 1990, which was shown simultaneously with a Titian show, also at the National Gallery. Then in 1993, Peter Sutton's Great Age of Rubens show, held in Boston and Toledo, and the Getty's exhibition organized by Ann Woollett on the collaboration of Rubens and Bruegel. As is evident from the enthusiastic reactions to the Van Dyck exhibition here at the Frick, new generations of art lovers find great joy in seeing thoughtfully conceived presentations of masterpieces from this period. The exciting thing, of course, is that the story is not complete. We are realizing more and more, for example, that Dutch and Flemish worlds were not as separate as has long been thought, but that artists like Van Dyck, De Heem, Jordans, Lievens, and Sweerts worked in both the North and the South, and that Rubens' art was hugely admired by, among others, Rembrandt and the Prince of Orange. The 19th century idea of intermingling Dutch and Flemish artists in lists, as did Stier and Bryan, is perhaps more accurate than not. See, for example, how effectively Dutch and Flemish paintings coexist in the extraordinary Heinz collection of still life paintings. As in Boston and Chicago and elsewhere, the National Gallery is making concerted efforts to intermingle paintings by Dutch and Flemish artists to demonstrate the interrelationships that exist among these wonderful artists. Ideas and collections will continue to evolve as new generations of art historians, such as those that will be speaking in this symposium, collectors and dealers discover or reinterpret aspects of Flemish art that will make us see fresh, well-known masterpieces and those yet to be found. Thank you very much.